The dirty boy walked into the city's most elite translation office. The millionaire laughed at him. "I'll translate your entire document for $500, the boy said with confidence. The banker's smile froze forever when he heard what came next. The rain hammered against the windows of the small, shared apartment on the Lower East Side, creating a rhythm that Thomas had learned to fall asleep to years ago. At 12 years old, he'd already developed the skill of finding comfort in the uncomfortable, a necessary talent when your home consisted of 2 rooms, a kitchen the size of a closet, and dreams that seemed impossibly large for someone with so little. He sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of his room, laptop balanced precariously on his knees. The device was ancient, held together with determination and duct tape, much like everything else in his life. But it was his gateway to the world, his escape route from the crushing weight of poverty that surrounded him like fog he couldn't quite shake off. On the screen before him was a job listing. Translator needed. Dutch to English. $500 per document. Must be fluent. Thomas's heart had been racing ever since he'd found it. $500. That was more money than his single mother made in a week. It was the difference between eating properly and skipping meals. It was the possibility of buying Emma, his 8-year-old sister, new shoes that actually fit. He'd been teaching himself languages for 2 years now, ever since he realized that the library had unlimited access to free learning materials. While other kids his age were obsessing over video games and social media, Thomas had been systematically working through language courses, YouTube tutorials, and practice conversations with international strangers on forums. Dutch had been his latest project, started 6 weeks ago when he'd discovered a documentary that fascinated him. He could read it. He could speak it. He understood the grammatical structures, the cultural nuances, the subtle differences between formal and casual speech. But did he know it well enough to translate a professional document? Did he have the confidence to walk into the world of adults and claim expertise he'd never formally studied? The question that haunted him was more pressing. Did he have any choice? The money he'd earned from odd jobs, helping Mr. Garcia deliver packages, cleaning storefronts early in the morning before school, helping at the corner store, barely added up to anything. His mother worked 2 jobs, and still they were always behind on rent. Emma needed a doctor's visit for her persistent cough, but they couldn't afford it without going into debt they'd never recover from. Thomas clicked on the job listing again. The company was called Ashford Global Translation Services, located in a prestigious building in Manhattan. The description mentioned working with corporate clients, legal documents, and international business correspondence. It sounded impossibly professional, impossibly out of reach. But the address was clear. The email was clear. The offer was clear. He had nothing to lose except his dignity, and poverty had already taught him how little that was worth. 3 days later, Thomas stood in front of the Ashford building, his reflection mocking him in the polished glass doors. His clothes were clean. His mother had washed them the night before, but they bore the unmistakable signs of being worn and re-worn. His sneakers had a hole in the sole that he'd stuffed with newspaper. His hair, though combed, stuck up at odd angles no matter what he did. The lobby was intimidating. Everything gleamed with the kind of wealth that Thomas had only ever seen in photographs. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers. The furniture looked like sculptures that nobody was actually supposed to sit on. The people moving through the space were draped in expensive fabrics. Their phones looked like they cost more than his entire wardrobe. He approached the reception desk with legs that felt uncertain, as if they didn't quite believe in his right to be here. "I'm here about a translation job," he said quietly. "I responded to your posting about Dutch to English translation." The receptionist, a woman with perfectly styled hair and an expression of practiced disinterest, looked up from her computer. Her eyes moved across Thomas in a single dismissive sweep. He could see her categorizing him. Poor, young, obviously lost, definitely not here for legitimate business. "We don't have any positions for interns," she said, her tone suggesting that even that word was generous. "And you need to be at least 18 to work here." "I'm not here as an intern," Thomas said, trying to inject confidence into his voice even as his hands trembled. "I responded to a job posting for translation work, Dutch to English." Something flickered across the receptionist's face, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She sighed, clearly deciding this would be easier to handle by passing him off to someone else. "Sit over there," she said, pointing to one of the impossibly beautiful chairs. "I'll call someone." Thomas sat carefully, afraid that he'd somehow break the furniture just by existing near it. Around him, professional people moved with purpose, talking on phones, clicking through documents, existing in a world that seemed to operate on rules he didn't understand. The man who finally appeared was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without him having to do anything. His suit looked like it had been sewn specifically to fit his body. His watch probably cost more than Thomas's apartment. This was Victor Ashford. Even Thomas, who knew nothing about the translation business, recognized the name from the building directory. Founder and CEO. The man who had built this empire. "So," Victor said, his voice carrying the ease of someone utterly accustomed to being listened to. "The receptionist tells me you're here about a translation job. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said, standing up. The sudden movement made him feel even more aware of how small he was, how insignificant he must look to this man. Victor's eyes moved across Thomas in a slow assessment. Thomas could see the calculations happening behind those eyes, evaluating, judging, dismissing. "You're aware that translation requires professional certification, correct?" Victor asked. "Degrees in linguistics, years of experience, quality assurance training?" "I can translate Dutch," Thomas said simply, fluently. Victor's expression shifted. For just a moment, his carefully maintained professional mask slipped, and Thomas saw genuine amusement in his eyes. The kind of amusement usually reserved for particularly entertaining jokes at the expense of others. "You can translate Dutch," Victor repeated, as if testing the words in his mouth and finding them ridiculous. "You look like you barely speak English fluently, and you're claiming you can translate Dutch?" Laughter erupted from other people in the lobby. The receptionist covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A woman in business attire who'd been waiting for the elevator smiled with the kind of cruel pleasure that comes from watching someone else be humiliated. Thomas felt his face burning. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and run, to never come back, to accept his place in the world that had been so clearly defined for him. People like him didn't belong in places like this. But he thought about Emma's cough. He thought about his mother's exhausted face. He thought about the document that was still sitting in his email, a Dutch legal agreement that he'd already translated in his head 3 times over, each time becoming more confident in his accuracy. "I know I don't look like what you probably imagine a translator to be," Thomas said, his voice steadier now. "But looks don't determine ability. I can read, write, and speak Dutch fluently. I understand the legal terminology, the cultural context, the nuances of professional business Dutch." Victor's amusement intensified. "And what gives you this remarkable confidence exactly? Have you studied linguistics?" "No, sir." "Do you have a degree in translation?" "No, sir." "Have you ever translated anything professionally?" "No, sir." "Then why should I even consider?" "Because I'll translate your documents cheaper and better than your certified competitors," Thomas interrupted, then immediately regretted it. He'd been taught never to interrupt adults, especially not wealthy ones with power over your future. But the words were already out, and he couldn't take them back. The lobby fell completely silent. Victor's eyebrows rose slowly, as if Thomas had just done something so unexpected that reality itself needed a moment to adjust. "Is that so?" Victor said quietly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "And what would you charge for this remarkable service?" $500 per document, Thomas said, plus travel time if you need it in person. Victor laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that came from deep in his chest, the kind that suggested he found this situation to be the most entertaining thing that had happened to him all week. $500, Victor repeated, shaking his head. "Do you have any idea what our certified translators charge? Our experienced, professionally trained translators?" "No, sir." $1,500 to $3,000 per document, depending on complexity and turnaround time, Victor said. "And they've earned that rate through years of education and professional development. You want me to pay you $500 based on what exactly? Your confidence? Your youthful optimism?" "Based on my ability," Thomas said quietly. "I can translate Dutch. I can do it accurately. I can do it quickly. And I can do it for less than your other translators because I don't have the overhead costs." Victor studied Thomas for a long moment. The amusement was still in his eyes, but there was something else now, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity, quickly suppressed. "You know what?" Victor said finally. "This is actually entertaining. I have a document here that came in yesterday. Dutch technical specifications for a manufacturing process. It's moderately complex, about 3,000 words. Our best Dutch translator said it would take her 5 days to complete, and she quoted us $2,000. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen a few times. "I'm sending you the document now. You have until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, to send me a completed translation. If it's anywhere near professional quality, I'll consider your offer. If not, you leave here knowing you tried and that you don't belong in this business. Fair?" Thomas's heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might break through his ribs. "Yes, sir. That's fair." "You have my email?" Victor asked. "No, sir." Victor pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to Thomas with 2 fingers, as if the card itself might be contaminated by contact. "Use that. Send it from your email with subject line Dutch translation, manufacturing specs. Don't be late." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Already on his phone, his attention already moved to the next thing, the next problem, the next person who was actually worth his time. Thomas looked down at the business card. It was heavy stock, embossed lettering, all the markers of expensive prestige. Victor Ashford, founder and CEO, Ashford Global Translation Services. There was an email address, a phone number, an office address. Around him, the lobby had returned to normal operation, as if nothing remarkable had happened. But Thomas knew that something had fundamentally shifted. He'd been given an impossible deadline and impossible odds, which meant he had one night to prove that he belonged in a world that had never been designed with people like him in mind. He pulled out his phone as he walked out of the building, already accessing the email that Victor had sent. The document was open, waiting, hundreds of technical terms in Dutch swimming across his screen. It was 4 p.m. He had 17 hours. Thomas walked to the subway station, his mind already translating, already analyzing, already preparing for the work ahead. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the city lights in endless ripples. He had nothing to lose, and everything to prove. And tomorrow morning, when Victor Ashford read the translation, his smile was going to freeze in a way that would change everything. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of Emma coughing from the other room. Thomas had set up his workspace on the kitchen table, the only place with enough light and enough quiet to think. His mother wouldn't be home until after midnight, working her shift at the hospital. It was just him, the document, and the clock. He'd read through the entire translation once, making notes, identifying the technical terms, mapping out the structure. It was a manufacturing specification document for industrial machinery, the kind of thing that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. But to Thomas, it was a puzzle, and he loved puzzles. The Dutch was precise, technical, unambiguous, but that was exactly the kind of difficulty that most amateur translators missed. They thought translation was just replacing one word with another, but it was so much more than that. It was understanding context, understanding industry standards, understanding what the original author was trying to communicate, and then finding the exact equivalent in another language. Thomas opened a blank document and began to type. The first paragraph took him 20 minutes. Not because the Dutch was difficult, but because the English had to be perfect. It had to sound like it was written by someone who understood manufacturing specifications, who understood the machines being described, who understood the precise technical terminology that was expected in this field. He'd spent the last 2 years building this knowledge, not out of any grand plan, but because he was curious. He'd watched manufacturing videos in Dutch. He'd read instruction manuals for industrial equipment. He'd joined online forums where engineers discussed their work in Dutch, learning the language not just as words, but as a living system of communication. By 9 p.m., he'd completed about 800 words. His eyes ached and his fingers were sore, but he was making progress. The translation was flowing now, muscle memory kicking in, his brain recognizing patterns and making the connections that would turn technical Dutch into perfect technical English. Emma had fallen asleep hours ago, her cough finally quieted by the humidity from a pot of boiling water on the stove. Thomas had read her a story before she went to bed, something about a girl who could talk to animals. Emma had asked him if he could teach her to speak animal languages, and Thomas had promised that maybe someday he could. Maybe if he pulled this off, he could. Maybe there would be money for tutors, for books, for the kind of education that opened doors instead of slamming them shut. By midnight, he'd completed 2,000 words. His back ached from hunching over the laptop. His eyes felt like they were filled with sand. But he was more than halfway done, and the translation was good. Really good. He knew it was good because he could feel the difference between forced translation and natural translation. When he'd first started learning languages, his translations had felt wooden, like someone who didn't quite understand what they were reading. But now, having read thousands of words in Dutch, having listened to native speakers, having immersed himself as much as possible in the language, he could feel the flow of proper translation. At 2 a.m., Thomas finished the last section. He read through the entire translation once, checking for errors, looking for places where he could improve the phrasing. There were a few sentences where he tightened the language, a few technical terms where he found more precise equivalents. By 3 a.m., he was done. He sat back in his chair, exhausted beyond measure, and read through it one final time. The translation was professional. It was accurate. It was something that any professional translator would be proud of. Then doubt crept in, the kind of doubt that poverty plants in you. What if it wasn't good enough? What if Victor was looking for excuses to dismiss him, to prove that some poor kid from the Lower East Side could never really compete with people who'd been properly educated? What if this had all been a game to him, a way to amuse himself on a boring Thursday afternoon? Thomas knew the statistics. People like him didn't make it. They didn't escape. They ended up in the same situation as their parents, working impossible hours for impossible pay, always one emergency away from homelessness. But he also knew that he'd done something remarkable. He'd taken a 3,000-word technical document in Dutch and translated it into perfect English in 17 hours. Most professional translators would have needed much longer. He attached the document to an email, double-checked the subject line, and hit send at 3:47 a.m. Then he collapsed into bed, too exhausted even to worry about what would happen next. The next morning, Thomas woke to his phone buzzing insistently. It was 8:35 a.m., which meant he'd slept for less than 5 hours. He'd set an alarm to make sure he'd be awake before 9 a.m., before Victor could say anything about lateness. The phone showed an email notification from Victor Ashford's account, sent at 6:23 a.m. Thomas's heart started racing. He opened the email with shaking fingers. "I've sent your translation to my Dutch-speaking colleagues for verification. I'll have their assessment by noon. Don't call me. I'll contact you if I need anything. VA." That was it. No indication of whether the translation was good or bad. Just a simple instruction to wait. Thomas read the email 15 times, trying to extract meaning from every word, every punctuation choice. He made breakfast for Emma. Cereal with the last of the milk, a banana, juice that was more water than actual fruit juice. She was still coughing, her small body racked with the kind of persistent illness that came from living in a damp apartment with no proper heating. "Did you sleep?" Emma asked, studying his face with the intensity of an 8-year-old who'd learned to read adult emotions as a survival skill. "A little bit," Thomas said. "I was working on something important." "The translation thing?" Thomas was surprised that she remembered. He'd mentioned it briefly the night before, not wanting to build up her hopes, not wanting to create expectations that might be crushed. "Yeah," he said. "The translation thing. Are you going to get the money?" Emma asked hopefully. "I don't know yet," Thomas said honestly. "We'll find out later today." The hours until noon stretched out like taffy. Thomas tried to go to school, but he couldn't concentrate. He sat in math class, staring at numbers that didn't make sense, thinking about Dutch verb conjugations instead. His English teacher asked him to read a passage aloud, and he did it on autopilot, his mind already somewhere else. At lunch, he sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, pushing food around his tray without eating. Other kids clustered in groups, talking about weekend plans, about parties, about things that required money to do. Thomas had learned a long time ago that it was easier to eat alone than to explain why he couldn't participate in their world. By 11:45 a.m., he couldn't stand it anymore. He told the school nurse he felt sick, which wasn't technically a lie. His stomach had been in knots all morning. and got permission to go home. He sat on the subway watching the city flash past, watching people in expensive clothes checking their phones, going about their days with the kind of certainty that came from never having to wonder where the next meal was coming from. When he got home, Emma was still at after-school care, so he had the apartment to himself. He sat on the kitchen table and stared at his phone, willing it to ring. It rang at 12:17 p.m. Thomas's hands were shaking so badly he could barely answer. "Is this Thomas?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, female. "Yes," Thomas managed. "This is Thomas. My name is Dr. Patricia Chen. I'm one of the senior linguists here at Ashford Global. I've been reviewing your translation and I need to ask you some questions." Thomas's stomach dropped. Questions were bad. Questions meant they'd found errors. "Of course," he said quietly. "First, I need to know where you studied Dutch," Dr. Chen said. "Where did you get your formal education?" I'm self-taught," Thomas admitted. "I learned from online resources, practice conversations, educational videos." There was a long pause. Thomas could hear papers rustling in the background. "Thomas," Dr. Chen said finally, "I've been translating Dutch to English professionally for 23 years. I have a master's degree in linguistics from Georgetown University. I've translated legal documents, medical reports, technical specifications, everything. And I need to tell you something." "Here it comes," Thomas thought. "Here's where she tells me it's not good enough." "Your translation is exceptional," Dr. Chen said. "It's not just accurate, it's elegant. You've managed to preserve the technical precision of the original while making it sound completely natural in English. There are places where you've actually improved upon the original Dutch by finding more precise equivalents in English. That's the mark of someone who really understands both languages at a deep level." Thomas couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. "But that's the thing that confuses me," Dr. Chen continued. "Self-taught people don't usually produce work at this level, not without decades of experience. So, I need to ask you directly, did you actually translate this document yourself? Or did you use translation software and then edit it?" "I translated it myself," Thomas said, his voice coming out as barely a whisper. "Every word. I didn't use any software. I don't even know how to use translation software." Another pause. "Where did you grow up?" Dr. Chen asked suddenly, the question seeming random. "The Lower East Side," Thomas said. "In Manhattan." "Why?" "Because I grew up there too," Dr. Chen said quietly. "My parents were immigrants from Taiwan. My mother worked as a seamstress, my father as a janitor. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and it was only because I got a full scholarship. I learned languages because my parents' friends from different countries would visit, and I wanted to be able to talk to them." "Oh," Thomas said, not sure what to say to this revelation. "I want to hand you over to Mr. Ashford now," Dr. Chen said. "But before I do, I want to tell you something. I'm going to recommend that he hire you not as a freelancer, but as a paid intern with proper benefits and training. What you have is natural talent that's been honed through dedication. That's worth investing in." She transferred him before Thomas could respond. Victor's voice came on the line, and he sounded completely different from yesterday. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like respect. "Thomas," Victor said, and it was the first time he'd used Thomas's first name. "I owe you an apology." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I sent your translation to my people expecting to find flaws," Victor continued. "I wanted to prove that amateur enthusiasm couldn't compete with professional expertise. I wanted to prove a point about the importance of formal education and proper credentials." He paused, and Thomas could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "Your translation is among the best we've ever received," Victor said finally. "And Dr. Chen has made some compelling arguments about your potential. I'd like to make you a formal offer." "An offer?" Thomas's voice shook. "We want to hire you as a paid intern," Victor said. 20 hours a week during the school year, more during the summer. We'll pay you $15 an hour to start, with raises as you prove yourself. We'll also provide you with professional training in translation methodology, business practices, and industry standards. In exchange, you'll work for us, learning the trade. $15 an hour, 20 hours a week. That was $300 a week. Thomas's mind was already doing the math, calculating how many medical appointments for Emma that would cover, how much of the rent that would pay, how many actual groceries they could buy instead of the cheapest, least nutritious options. Thomas started, then stopped. Why are you offering me this? Because, Victor said slowly. Dr. Chen reminded me of something I'd forgotten. She reminded me that talent doesn't care about credentials, that intelligence doesn't require a diploma, that sometimes the people who most desperately want something are the ones who will work hardest to achieve it. He paused again. And because, Victor continued, his voice quieter now, I was wrong about you. I was wrong in a way that I think I've been wrong about a lot of things. And I'd like the opportunity to be right going forward. Thomas felt tears sliding down his face, which was embarrassing, but he couldn't seem to stop them. When do I start? He asked. Tomorrow, Victor said. After school. Come to the office at 3 p.m. Bring your laptop. We'll set up a proper workspace for you. And Thomas? Yes? Congratulations, Victor said. You just changed your life. That evening, Thomas sat with Emma as she ate her dinner. Actual chicken, actual vegetables, actual rice instead of just plain pasta. He'd stopped at the grocery store on his way home and bought real food for the first time in months. Emma asked why, and Thomas just said they were celebrating. She didn't need to know all the details. She didn't need to know about poverty or desperation or the way the world tried to keep people like them in their place. She just needed to know that her brother had done something remarkable and that things were going to be different now. Later, after Emma was asleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and started looking at colleges. Real colleges, not the impossible dream he'd always thought of them as, but actual institutions where he might study linguistics, where he might turn this natural talent into something even bigger. The door opened, and his mother came home from her hospital shift, exhausted and worn down by 12 hours of thankless work. Thomas, she said, surprised to find him still awake. What's wrong? Are you sick? No, Mom, Thomas said, and he smiled at her. Something really good happened today. Really, really good. As he told her about Victor's offer, about the translation, about the job and the money and the opportunity, he watched her face transform. He watched her understand what this meant, not just for him, but for all of them. He watched her cry, not from sadness, but from relief, from hope, from the first real glimpse she'd had in years that things might actually get better. And in that moment, Thomas understood something that Victor Ashford was only just beginning to learn, that the real translation wasn't about changing words from one language to another. The real translation was about taking a life that seemed predetermined, that seemed destined to repeat the patterns of poverty and struggle, and transforming it into something completely different. That was the kind of translation that actually mattered. Thomas arrived at the Ashford building at 2:45 p.m. on Monday, 15 minutes early. His mother had given him money for new clothes over the weekend. Not expensive clothes, but clothes that fit properly and didn't have visible repairs. He'd spent the morning getting ready, showering with the kind of care usually reserved for special occasions, combing his hair until it lay flat against his head, instead of sticking up in random directions. Emma had made him promise to tell her everything about his day. She'd pressed a drawing into his hands before he left, a stick figure labeled Thomas, standing in a tall building with a smile that took up half his face. He'd tucked it carefully into his backpack, next to his laptop, and the notebook where he'd been taking notes on translation methodology for the past 2 days. The lobby was less intimidating the second time. He recognized the receptionist. She gave him a small, almost apologetic smile when she saw him, as if she regretted how she'd treated him on Friday. He walked past her directly to the elevators, pressing the button for the 14th floor where Victor's office was located. The elevator opened onto a floor that was nothing like the lobby. This was the working heart of the company. Cubicles and open workspaces, people sitting at desks with headphones on, translation software open on multiple monitors, reference materials stacked in organized piles. It was nothing like what Thomas had imagined. He'd thought working at an elite company would mean some kind of sterile perfection, but this looked like what it actually was. A place where people worked, where they made mistakes, where they drank too much coffee and got stressed about deadlines. Victor was waiting for him, standing by a glass-walled office that overlooked the entire floor. He was wearing an expensive suit like always, but something had changed about him. His expression was different, less guarded, more open. Thomas, Victor said, extending his hand. Welcome to Ashford Global. I'm glad you're here. The handshake was firm, genuine. No condescension, No trace of the man who'd laughed at Thomas just 4 days ago. "Thank you for the opportunity," Thomas said, trying to project confidence while internally terrified that he'd somehow made a mistake, that this was all going to fall apart. "Come on," Victor said. "Let me show you around. I want to introduce you to some people." As they walked through the office, Thomas noticed something interesting. Some people looked curious when they saw him, some looked skeptical, and a few looked openly hostile. One man in particular, tall, in his 30s, with expensive glasses and the kind of bearing that suggested he was important, watched Thomas with barely concealed contempt. "That's Marcus Chen," Victor said quietly when they'd passed him. "Senior translator, head of our Dutch division. He's won multiple translation awards." "Should I be worried?" Thomas asked. "Probably," Victor said honestly. "Marcus has been with the company for 8 years. He's built his reputation on being the best. Having a 12-year-old come in and do work that rivals his is going to sting his ego." They reached a small desk near a window. It wasn't a cubicle exactly, more of a proper workspace. There was a computer setup, professional translation software already installed, a bookshelf with reference materials, and a nameplate that read, "Thomas Rivera, Translation Associate." Thomas had given them his last name on the phone call when they'd worked out the employment details, and seeing it on a nameplate felt surreal. He had a nameplate. He had a desk. He was employed. "This is yours," Victor said. "You have access to all our translation databases, all our software, all our reference materials. If you need something, you ask. If you run into a problem, you come to me or Dr. Chen. You don't try to figure it out alone. Understood?" "Understood," Thomas said. "Your first assignment is going to be easier than the manufacturing specs," Victor continued. "A hotel chain needs their website translated from Dutch to English. Standard marketing copy. Probably 6,000 words. You have a week. That's about 1,200 words a day, which should be well within your capability." "I can do it faster than that," Thomas said. "I'm sure you can," Victor said. "But I'm going to ask you to take your time. Translation isn't just about speed. It's about quality, about making sure every word carries the right weight, the right emotion. I don't want you burning yourself out." There was something almost fatherly in his tone, and Thomas realized something that startled him. Victor actually cared. This wasn't just about hiring cheap talent or proving something. Victor genuinely wanted Thomas to succeed. Over the next few hours, Dr. Chen came by to check on him. She brought him a coffee, which he didn't drink because he was 12 and caffeine felt like something adults did, and spent time explaining the software, the database systems, the quality assurance procedures that all translations went through before being sent to clients. "You did excellent work," Dr. Chen said, sitting on the edge of his desk. "But that was under pressure, in a limited time frame. This is going to be different. This is about proving that you can do this consistently, day after day, year after year. That you can handle the pressure of working with real clients who have real expectations." "What if I can't?" Thomas asked quietly. "Then you learn," Dr. Chen said. "That's what being a professional is. It's not just having talent. It's having the discipline to keep improving, to keep learning, to handle setbacks gracefully. You're going to make mistakes here, probably lots of them. The question is whether you'll learn from them or let them defeat you." She left him with those words, and Thomas sat alone at his new desk, looking at the hotel website that needed to be translated, feeling the weight of expectation and opportunity and fear all at once. He was so focused on the work that he almost didn't notice Marcus Chen approaching until the man was standing right next to his desk. "So you're the child prodigy," Marcus said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The self-taught genius who's going to revolutionize the translation industry." Thomas looked up, gauging whether this was going to turn into a confrontation. Marcus's body language suggested it might. "I don't know about that," Thomas said carefully. "I'm just trying to do good work." "You're trying to make people like me look bad," Marcus said sharply. "You know how long I've been doing this. 8 years of professional experience, a master's degree in linguistics, certifications from international translation organizations, and a kid with no education, no credentials, no experience, just waltzes in and does work that supposedly rivals mine." "I'm not trying to rival anyone," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm just trying to do what I'm asked to do." "Victor's having a midlife crisis," Marcus continued, his voice low so no one else could hear. He's trying to prove some point about talent and credentials not mattering. But you know what? They matter. They matter because they represent years of study and discipline and growth. You think you're going to come in here and change everything just because you're smart? You're not. You're going to crash and burn, and then Victor will realize that expertise actually matters. Marcus walked away before Thomas could respond, leaving him sitting there feeling something he hadn't felt in a few days. Doubt. He tried to focus on the translation work, but Marcus's words kept echoing in his head. What if he was right? What if Thomas was just a novelty, a temporary curiosity that would eventually be exposed as insufficient? What if the success with the manufacturing specs was a fluke? At 5 p.m., when his shift ended, Thomas packed up his laptop and tried not to think about the voice in his head telling him he didn't belong here. The next 3 weeks were brutal in ways Thomas hadn't anticipated. The hotel translation was completed in 5 days instead of 7. It was excellent work, the kind that made even Marcus reluctantly admit it was competent. But the praise was always followed by criticism. For a first real project, it's good. But wait until you deal with marketing translation where cultural nuance matters. That's where your lack of experience will show. Thomas started having problems sleeping. His mind would race through translation work after he'd already completed it, second-guessing word choices, worrying about idioms he might have missed, terrified that he was going to make a mistake that would prove everyone right, that he didn't really belong here. At school, his teachers started noticing that something was wrong. His grades were slipping. He kept falling asleep in class. One day, during math, he couldn't even remember what 9 times 7 was, and the embarrassment of having to count it out on his fingers nearly made him cry in front of the entire class. His mother noticed too. She'd come home from her shifts to find him still at the kitchen table, working on translations, pushing himself to be perfect, to prove that he deserved this opportunity. "Thomas," she said one night, sitting down across from him at 2 a.m., "you're going to make yourself sick." "I have to be good at this," Thomas said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "If I'm not perfect, they'll fire me. If they fire me, we're back to nothing. I can't let that happen." His mother took his hands in hers. "Listen to me. You're 12 years old. You should be playing with friends, doing homework, sleeping 8 hours a night. You shouldn't be this stressed." "But the money isn't worth your health," his mother said firmly. "I didn't work myself to the bone for you to follow the same path. I did it so you could have a better life, not so you could work yourself to death at 12. Thomas wanted to explain that it wasn't that simple, that if he didn't prove himself now, that better life would disappear. But he was too tired to argue. The next day, he requested a meeting with Victor. "I think I should quit," Thomas said without preamble. He'd spent an hour preparing the speech, and now he just wanted to get it out before he lost his nerve. Victor, who'd been reviewing some documents, looked up with genuine alarm. "What? Why would you think that?" "Because I'm not good enough," Thomas said. "Marcus was right. I'm going to burn out. I'm not equipped to do this. I should go back to school and focus on being a normal kid." Victor set down his pen and studied Thomas carefully. "Sit down," he said. Thomas sat. 4 weeks ago, Victor began, a boy I'd never met walked into this building looking like he'd been sleeping in an alley. I mocked him in front of my staff. I tried to humiliate him. I wanted to prove that talent without credentials was worthless. He paused, letting his words settle. And then he produced work that showed me something I'd forgotten. Victor continued. "He showed me that I'd become the kind of person I didn't want to be. Cold, dismissive, measured everyone by credentials and appearance instead of actual ability. But I'm not actually good enough," Thomas started. "You are," Victor interrupted. "But you're also not good enough yet. And that's okay. That's how this works. Marcus Chen wasn't good enough when he started either. He was terrible, actually. I saw his first translation. It was awful. But he learned. He grew. He became excellent through years of work and dedication and making mistakes and fixing them." Victor leaned forward. "But there's a difference between pushing yourself to excellence and destroying yourself, trying to be perfect. Marcus is thriving because he understands that balance. He pushes hard, but he also sleeps. He also has a life outside of this office." "How am I supposed to have a life?" Thomas asked. "I have work and school and family responsibilities. When do I get to just be a kid?" That's the real question, isn't it? Victor said quietly. And I'm not going to lie to you and say it gets easier. But I am going to tell you something that might help. Victor stood and walked to his window, looking out over Manhattan. When I was starting out, Victor said, I worked constantly. 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I thought that was what success required. And I did become successful. I made money, built a company, got respect. But I sacrificed everything else. I missed my daughter growing up. I damaged relationships beyond repair. I got so focused on proving I was worthy of success that I forgot to actually enjoy it. He turned back to face Thomas. You're going to face choices I didn't face until I was in my 40s, Victor continued. You're going to have to decide what success actually means to you. Is it proving something to Marcus, to the world? Or is it building a life that's actually worth living? Thomas didn't have an answer. Here's what we're going to do, Victor said. I'm reducing your hours to 15 per week instead of 20. You're going to prioritize school. You're going to have time to rest. And yes, your progress will be slower. Yes, you might fall behind where you could be, but you'll still be learning. You'll still be growing. And you'll do it in a way that doesn't destroy your childhood. Will I still have the job? Thomas asked carefully. You'll still have the job, Victor confirmed, but only if you promise me something. What? That you'll tell someone, me, Dr. Chen, your mother, someone, if you start feeling like this again, Victor said. Success isn't worth your mental health. No amount of money is worth sacrificing who you are. I learned that lesson too late. Let me help you learn it early. Something in Thomas shifted then. The pressure that had been building up for 3 weeks suddenly released, not disappearing entirely but becoming manageable. He wasn't going to be perfect. That was okay. He could be good, and he could keep improving. And that was enough. Okay, Thomas said quietly. Good, Victor said. Now get out of here. Go home. Play with your sister. Remember what it's like to be 12 years old. That evening, Thomas played with Emma for the first time in weeks. They built a fort out of blankets and pillows, and she told him elaborate stories about a kingdom of cats that lived in the clouds. He listened without checking his phone, without thinking about translations, without measuring himself against some impossible standard. His mother watched from the doorway, and when he caught her eye, she smiled. Not the desperate, grateful smile she'd given when he first got the job. A real smile. A relieved smile. A smile that said she could see her son again instead of just a worried, exhausted extension of necessity. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Victor called. I spoke with Marcus, Victor said without preamble. I told him that his negativity toward you is unacceptable and that it stops now. He tried to argue that he was just being honest, that the industry is competitive and harsh. I told him that's not how we operate here. What did he say? Thomas asked. He said he'd think about it, Victor replied. But I want you to know something. What he did, trying to undermine you, trying to make you doubt yourself, that says nothing about your abilities. It says everything about his insecurity. After they hung up, Thomas sat alone in the dark apartment, thinking about Marcus and Victor and what it meant to work in a world where your value could be questioned so easily. He thought about the boy he'd been a month ago, desperate, certain that hard work was the only answer, willing to sacrifice anything for an opportunity. He was still that boy in many ways, but he was also becoming something else. Someone who understood that opportunity was just the beginning, that the real work was learning how to be okay with not being perfect, how to push yourself without destroying yourself, how to succeed without losing yourself in the process. And somehow, that seemed like a more valuable lesson than any translation he could ever complete. 6 weeks after that conversation with Victor, Thomas was translating a pharmaceutical document when Marcus appeared at his desk. We need to talk, Marcus said quietly, looking uncomfortable in a way Thomas had never seen before. Thomas followed him to a break room on the 14th floor. It was empty except for an old coffee machine and a window overlooking the Hudson River. Marcus sat on one of the plastic chairs and gestured for Thomas to do the same. I owe you an apology, Marcus began, and Thomas could tell this was costing him something. What I said to you, the way I treated you, it was wrong. Thomas waited. He'd learned from his mother that sometimes people needed space to get out what they were trying to say. I was scared, Marcus continued. When you arrived, When your translation was better than work I'd spent years perfecting, I felt threatened, like you proved that everything I'd worked for didn't matter, that I could be replaced by a kid with no credentials. You can't be replaced, Thomas said carefully. You have 8 years of experience. I have 8 weeks. That's not why I was scared, Marcus said, and his voice cracked slightly. I was scared because I realized something about myself. I've spent 8 years building a reputation, winning awards, proving my worth through work. And when someone came along who was naturally gifted at something I'd studied for years to master, I didn't want to help you. I wanted to destroy you. Marcus looked directly at Thomas. That's not who I want to be. Over the next few minutes, Marcus told him his story. He'd grown up in a wealthy family but had suffered a crisis of identity in his 20s. He'd wanted to prove that his success came from his own merit, not his parents' money. Translation had become his mission, his way of proving his value. And he'd become so focused on being the best that he'd forgotten why he'd chosen this field in the first place. I love languages, Marcus said. I love the way they work, the way a single word can carry centuries of cultural meaning. Somewhere along the way, I stopped loving translation and started just competing. Why are you telling me this? Thomas asked. Because Victor told me to, Marcus said with a small smile. He said that the only person who could truly help me understand what I'd become was someone like you. Someone talented but still humble enough to care about the work instead of just the recognition. Marcus pulled out a folder. I want to help you. I want to teach you what I've learned, not to make you like me, but to help you avoid becoming like me, to help you stay connected to what you love about this work. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus became Thomas's mentor in a way Victor never could be. He showed Thomas the intricacies of professional translation, the databases, the shortcuts, the techniques that made work faster without sacrificing quality. But more importantly, he showed Thomas how to think like a professional translator. You translate technically well, Marcus said one afternoon, while they worked through a difficult Dutch medical text together. But you translate like a machine, accurate but cold. What makes translation art, instead of just transcription, is understanding the human beneath the words. He pointed to a sentence describing a patient's suffering. You translated this literally, correct, but it doesn't land emotionally. Watch. Marcus rewrote it in a way that preserved the technical meaning, but added a layer of humanity. Thomas felt the difference immediately. It was the same information, but it made the reader feel something. That's what separates good translators from great ones, Marcus said. Understanding that language carries emotion, not just information. Thomas started staying late, not because he was pressured to, but because he wanted to learn. Marcus stayed with him, and they'd work through difficult passages, arguing about word choices, exploring the nuances of language in ways that felt less like work and more like play. One evening, while they were debating the best way to translate a Dutch idiom about time, Victor walked by and stopped. This is what I wanted, Victor said, and both of them looked up. This is what real mentorship looks like. Not someone trying to prove their worth by tearing someone down, but someone choosing to help someone else become better. Victor sat down with them. I need to tell you both something. I've been reflecting on my philosophy here, on what I've built, and I've realized I've made a mistake with how I've structured this company. What do you mean? Marcus asked. I've created a culture of competition instead of collaboration, Victor said. I've rewarded individual excellence instead of collective growth, and that's made people like Marcus excellent but unhappy, and it's put enormous pressure on people like Thomas to prove themselves constantly. Victor looked between them. I want to change that. I want to create a mentorship program where senior translators like Marcus work with emerging talent like Thomas, not as a threat, but as a responsibility, a way of passing on knowledge. What would that look like? Marcus asked, and Thomas could hear genuine interest in his voice. Money, Victor said bluntly. Mentors get paid extra for their time. Significant money. Because teaching the next generation should be valued as much as individual translation work. Over the next hour, they discussed the program. Marcus would work with Thomas, but also with 2 other young translators that Victor wanted to hire. In exchange, Marcus would receive a bonus that would essentially double his salary. More importantly, he'd be building a legacy, teaching the next generation how to do translation not just well, but meaningfully. "This is what I've been learning," Victor said as they wrapped up. "Real success isn't about being the best individually. It's about building something that's bigger than yourself. It's about creating the conditions where other people can thrive." He looked at Thomas. "You taught me that when you walked in here and demanded respect despite your circumstances. Marcus, you're teaching me that redemption is always possible if you're willing to look at yourself honestly. And both of you are teaching me that the greatest achievement isn't what you accomplish alone, but what you accomplish together." 3 months into his job, Thomas found himself in a strange new position. He wasn't the only young translator anymore. Victor had hired 2 others, a 19-year-old named Sophia who'd learned Spanish and Portuguese through online education, and a 16-year-old named David who'd taught himself German through music and could translate poetry with haunting precision. Marcus worked with all 3 of them, but he'd taken particular interest in David because David was struggling with the same pressure that had nearly broken Thomas. "I can feel him pushing too hard," Marcus told Thomas one afternoon. "The same way you were pushing, and I recognize myself in him, trying to prove something instead of just being." Marcus had taken David under his wing in a way that was surprisingly protective. He limited his hours, made sure he took breaks, encouraged him to remember that he was still a child with a whole life ahead of him. Watching Marcus do this, Thomas realized something important. Redemption wasn't about forgetting who you'd been. It was about taking who you'd been and becoming someone better. Thomas was no longer the desperate boy who'd walked into this building trying to translate a document for $500. He was becoming a professional, but he was also, perhaps more importantly, becoming someone who understood that success without compassion was just achievement without meaning. His work had improved too. With Marcus's guidance, his translations had moved beyond technical accuracy into something more nuanced. His latest assignment, a Dutch novel that needed English translation for publication, was some of the best work he'd ever done. Victor had read sections of it and called it literature. That night, when Thomas's mother came home from her hospital shift, he made dinner. Real dinner, not the bare minimum. He'd learned to cook watching cooking shows in Dutch, translating instructions in his head just for fun. They sat together, his mother and Emma, and he told them about Marcus and about David and about how the company was changing. "I'm proud of you," his mother said simply. "Not for the money, though that's helped us more than you know, but for who you're becoming. You could have let that job make you cold and competitive. Instead, you're learning to be kind." Emma, who'd been drawing while they ate, held up her latest picture. It showed 3 figures labeled Thomas, Marcus, and David, all holding hands, all smiling. "You're a team now," Emma said matter-of-factly, and Thomas realized she was right. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about him proving something and become about all of them building something together. Thomas stood in the Ashford Building lobby 4 years later, watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new Translation Academy. He was 16 now, no longer the desperate boy who'd walked through these doors in worn sneakers. He wore a suit that actually fit him, chosen without the anxiety that used to accompany anything requiring appearance. The academy was Victor's vision realized completely. A fully funded program offering free professional translation training to young people from low-income backgrounds. No application fees, no credential requirements, just talent, curiosity, and determination. The ribbon fell, and applause filled the lobby. Victor stood beside a woman who shared his silver hair and confident bearing, his daughter, Rebecca, whom he'd rebuilt his relationship with over the past 4 years. She was smiling with genuine pride, not the polite smile of someone obligated to attend an event. Thomas had met Rebecca only a few weeks ago when Victor had finally opened up about his personal life. He'd spent so much time focused on rebuilding his professional world that he'd almost forgotten to rebuild the rest of it. But Rebecca, upon learning what her father had become, had forgiven him with a grace that moved everyone who witnessed it. "There he is," Marcus said, appearing beside Thomas with his characteristic ease. Marcus was the Academy's academic director, having stepped back from full-time translation work to focus entirely on teaching. He seemed happier than Thomas had ever seen him, finally at peace with who he was. "Lot of people here," Thomas observed, watching the crowd. 43 applicants for the first cohort, Marcus said. "All of them like you were. Smart, driven, stuck on the wrong side of the tracks. Victor's going to change a lot of lives. Sophia walked past them toward the stage, where she'd been asked to speak as one of the program's success stories. She'd been with the company for 3 years now, had published a collection of translated Spanish poetry, and had become something of an inspiration herself. The shy 19-year-old who'd arrived uncertain had transformed into someone confident and skilled. David was somewhere in the crowd too, now 17 and already being scouted by universities despite his unconventional education. He'd become friends with Thomas despite their age difference, and they often worked together on literary translations, the kind of work that neither of them would have imagined possible when they first started. Victor found Thomas in the crowd and pulled him aside. "I wanted to thank you," Victor said, "before things get too hectic." "For what?" Thomas asked. "For teaching me what I should have known all along," Victor said. "For walking into this building and refusing to accept that your circumstances defined your worth. For being willing to work hard but also smart enough to know when to stop. For helping me become someone my daughter could actually respect." Before Thomas could respond, an older man appeared in the doorway, someone Thomas had never seen before, but who made his stomach drop with inexplicable recognition. "Excuse me," the man said, approaching the group. He was tall, with features that were disturbingly familiar. "I'm looking for Thomas Rivera. Someone told me he'd be here today." Thomas's mother had never talked much about his father. When Thomas was very young, she'd said he'd left before Thomas was born, that he'd been young and unprepared for responsibility. As Thomas got older, he'd stopped asking. The absence had become its own kind of presence. "I'm Thomas," he heard himself say. The man's eyes filled with tears. "My God, you look like her, like your mother." "This is—" Thomas didn't know what to say. "Your father," Victor said quietly, understanding the situation. "I had someone find him. I thought you deserved to know who he was, and he deserved to know what he'd missed." The man, whose name was Daniel, sat down as if his legs had given out. "I was 19 when you were born," he said. "I was terrified and selfish, and I ran. Your mother told me she didn't want me around, and I was relieved because it meant I didn't have to face what I'd done. But I never stopped thinking about you." "Why come now?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "Because Mr. Ashford contacted me," Daniel said. "He told me about you, about what you'd accomplished, who you'd become, and he said it was time I knew my son." Thomas looked at Victor, who shrugged apologetically. "I probably overstepped," Victor said, "but it seemed like something you deserved. The choice about what to do with that information is entirely yours." Over the next hour, Thomas sat with Daniel and listened to his story. Daniel had regretted his choice every day since, had become successful as a graphic designer in another city, had started a family that he loved but that never quite filled the hole left by the son he'd abandoned. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked only for the chance to know Thomas, even if it meant just being a presence in his life without any claim to the title of father. Thomas didn't know what he felt. Anger mixed with relief, mixed with something more complicated. But he did know one thing. He wasn't the same boy who'd needed to figure everything out alone. He had support now, community, people who cared about his well-being. "I want to know you," Thomas finally said. "Not as a father because that ship sailed, but as a person, as someone who's part of my history." Daniel nodded, tears flowing freely. "That's more than I deserve." The Academy's first graduation ceremony happened 1 year later. Thomas, now 17 and a full-time translator while continuing his education, stood backstage watching the first cohort of students prepare to receive their certificates. There were 42 of them. 42 young people from circumstances like Thomas's had been, who'd come to Ashford not knowing if they had a real shot at a professional career. Now they were trained, credentialed through the Academy's rigorous program, and almost all of them already had job offers. One girl, barely 15, was shaking with nerves about her future. Thomas recognized that fear. He'd lived it. "You're going to be fine," he told her. "Better than fine. You're going to be extraordinary, and in a few years you won't even remember being this nervous." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "Because I was you," Thomas said. "And I'm here, standing on this stage as someone who's changed the course of their own life. So can you." Victor spoke at the ceremony, but not about translation or business or credentials. He spoke about the weight of circumstances, about the way poverty tries to convince you that you're less than you are, about the courage required to believe in yourself when the world has given you every reason not to. 4 years ago, Victor told the crowd, a boy walked into my office and proved to me that I'd been measuring human worth with all the wrong metrics. That boy changed my life. And now, through the work we're doing here, I'm hoping we can give thousands of young people the chance to change their own lives, and in doing so, to change the world. The camera panned across the audience. Thomas saw his mother, who'd taken the night off from her nursing job, tears streaming down her face. He saw Daniel, who'd become a genuine presence in his life over the past year, finally settling into being someone's father, even if it had taken 16 years to start. He saw Emma, now 12, so proud of her brother that she could barely sit still. He saw Marcus and Sophia and David and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by the transformation that had begun with one boy's desperate offer. After the ceremony, Thomas found himself alone on the roof of the building with Victor, both of them looking out at the city lights. "You could work for me forever," Victor said. "Become my head translator, run the academy, build something really big here." "But?" Thomas asked, hearing the unspoken word. "But you should also consider what I didn't," Victor said. "University, travel, experiencing the world more broadly. You have options now that you didn't have before, and you should take advantage of them. Don't make the mistake of thinking there's only one path forward." Thomas nodded. He'd been thinking about this. There were colleges that wanted him, that saw his unusual background as an asset rather than a liability. There were scholarships. There were possibilities. "What will you do?" Thomas asked Victor. "I'm stepping back," Victor said simply. "The academy is running smoothly. Marcus is the perfect director. The company is thriving under new management that understands collaboration. Rebecca and I are rebuilding our relationship, and I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not defined by work." He smiled. "Turns out I don't know, but I'm going to find out." "Thank you," Thomas said, "for everything, for giving me a chance, for believing in me, for helping me grow." "Thank you," Victor replied, "for reminding me that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute, for showing me that real power is about lifting others up." Years later, Thomas would think back on that moment on the roof and realize it was the true ending point of his journey. Not the beginning of his career, not the day he first got the job, but that moment when he understood that his success had never been just about him. He would go to university. He would travel to the Netherlands and immerse himself in Dutch culture more deeply. He would fall in love with a woman he met while translating poetry. He would eventually write a book about his journey that would inspire thousands of young people to pursue education despite their circumstances. But none of that would matter as much as the fact that he'd learned to balance ambition with compassion, achievement with humanity, success with service. The academy would expand. There would be 5 of them by the time Thomas was 30, spread across different cities, each one changing lives, each one proving that talent doesn't require credentials, that worth isn't determined by circumstances. And it would all trace back to one boy, too poor to afford the suit he wore to his job interview, who'd walked into a building and demanded respect despite everything telling him he didn't deserve it. Sometimes, when Thomas found himself doubting something, he'd remember that moment. He'd remember the dirty boy in the lobby. He'd remember that Victor's smile had frozen not with shock at his own worthlessness, but with the realization of his own blindness. And he'd remember that sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can create the biggest ripples of change.